thank you very much for joining us. And as you can see, there's quite a community of us here with you. And so maybe we could dive right in. And maybe what we could start with is maybe just checking in about where you're at right now. I think it might be interesting for people to know just where you are and how high up you are.
Okay, so I'm in my hermitage, which is in Holding in the national forest. I'm surrounded by 3 million acres of national forest, and I'm up at 3,000 meters. And I don't know if you can see out the window, but anyway, I'm in a high valley in the mountains.
Oh, wonderful.
Usually I'm at Upaya Zen Center, but I also have this hermitage in the mountains where I can come and refresh myself and meet new friends like this wonderful community you're introducing me to.
Thank you again for joining us, Roshi Joan. And then diving into our conversation today, one of the very big things or themes that we've seen come up for change makers in our community around the world is how to be present as we witness suffering all around us. And so I was wondering if you might be able to start off with helping us think about that.
Sure. You know, so there are about 128 of us online right now. I actually would love to, somebody's asking where are the mountains in New Mexico. So the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in New Mexico. Okay, so let me just start out with a little bit about my own background. I'm the abbot of Upaya Zen Center, but I've been, and I'm almost 80 years old, and I have been part of a world of social action since the 1960s, you know, which really opened me up through the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And then, you know, I was a student of anthropology and did anthropology in Africa and in Mexico. And then went to work at the University of Miami School of Medicine as a medical anthropologist and became very interested in the care of dying people. So my work has been in human rights issues and also been focused on what is it to change the culture of medicine, particularly as not only care of dying people, but those who care for dying people are experiencing extreme distress. And I would say that this is the case for clinicians now all over the world who are dealing with the current pandemic. So I wrote a book published a few years ago called Standing at the Edge. And that book focused on what I've learned from people who are in human rights organizations, people in the medical profession, educators, people in corporations, people who have done work in politics and such, as they have shared with me the challenges that they face in presencing suffering. Not only on the suffering of individuals, of human beings, but of creatures, and also the suffering that environmentalists face in terms of the extreme degradation of our environment and what we know as the sixth extinction. And the futility, the great sense of sorrow or grief, the experience of empathic distress when there's over-identification with suffering, the tendency to objectify in order not to be moved by suffering, or because that's how we actually deal with our experience of connecting with suffering, which is to objectify, and particularly issues around moral suffering. And so from what Aaron was saying this morning, or in the introduction, but also in our conversations over the past week, I think sharing a bit about what I have called edge states. These are states of qualities of heart and mind, and also perspectives that are really important for us to embody and enact, but also these qualities, these human virtues, have within them shadow aspects, causing people to be very distressed, burned out, suffering from moral conflict, and so forth. So I thought it would be, helpful to just go through some of that. But I always prefer, and since I don't know any of you, excuse me, if we could start with some questions, that would really be wonderful, because I always feel like I'm talking to a void when I'm on Zoom. And if I could hear a little bit from you about your work and also about your concerns, that would be really helpful.
Roshi, Joan,
so I'm wondering,
so
Aaron,
we're
if
going
you
to take
can
questions
help
from the group.
mediate that.
Absolutely. And so thank you for that, Roshi Halifax. And we'll be taking in questions in the chat, and I will translate those through. Maybe just to start with one question. And this is something that we've really seen come through as a question in our group, in our broader community. How do we attend to our own capacities and resources? What kinds of guidance or reflections might you have about that?
Well, I think, Aaron, one of the most important things is that we, quote, resource ourselves. And by resourcing ourselves, I mean by reflecting on the significance of our work to ourselves, how this work brings meaning to our lives. It gives us a sense of purpose. It gives us a sense of moral integrity, no matter the depth of difficulties that we face in doing this work. And there are so many that each of you must face. It's important, one, to have a kind of groundedness in what you're doing, and also to recall your motivation, why you chose to do the kind of work that you're doing. And this ethical and moral perspective becomes a really profound resource. It's as though I know that when I was in my 20s, in the 1960s, it was like a calling around issues related to racial injustice, and also around issues related to violence and to war. This was in terms of the war in Vietnam. And I felt it was a calling. The stress of that anti-war work and of the civil rights work was so great on us as young people, many of us as young people, that we fell into moral distress. And in a way, we almost forgot our calling because we were so distressed by the conditions that we were facing at that time. And it was when we would sit with each other and remember why we were there and appreciate the kind of commitment that we were manifesting, that became a resource for us as individuals and as a community. So I think that, this community is also um, a kind of circle that could also explore why you are doing this work, what calls you, what brings you meaning, what values are important to you as you do this work. And even if the outcome is not perfectly aligned with what you had aspired to, that you have done your best, no matter what the difficulties they're facing. So resourcing in terms of intention and motivation is really important. And it's also important to resource yourself in terms of very practical dimensions. The endocrinologist, G.R.A.C.E, who has looked at stress and trauma extensively, said that one has to be really disciplined about getting adequate sleep, about having a good diet, about exercising. These are all things that really enhance our well-being so we can offer ourselves more fully to the world. But he said one of the most overlooked aspects in terms of immune enhancement and also of having a sense of thriving or buoyancy or robustness when we're doing this kind of work is connection, our relationship with others. And so, you know, again, this circle that you have fostered, Erin, I think is a really good example of how important it is to be in relationship, to cherish those relationships and to use those relationships as a resource for keeping ourselves aligned and directed in the work that we're doing of service to others.
Thank you. I'm going to start weaving with the questions that so many people are asking in the chat. And so one question that I'd love to put to you is around boundaries and being able to have healthy boundaries. And then how can that support us when we are connecting with people so that we are careful about what we absorb and what we take in?
So I want to speak in this regard a little bit to empathy, because our capacity to be in resonance with the persons with whom we're serving is really important. You know, Erin, I have said that a world without empathy is a world where we are dead to each other. And by empathy, I mean that we're in physical resonance, emotional resonance, as well as cognitive resonance with those whom we're serving. And by that I mean, when I say resonance, there's a sense of identification or of expanding our subjectivity to include the experience of another. However, if there's over-identification with the suffering of others, we can experience what is called secondary trauma or empathic distress. So while on one hand, that experience of resonance is really important, that sense of, you know, including the person into your own subjective experience at the physical level, at the level of the heart, and also being able to see through the eyes of the other in such a way that you get a sense of, you know, how that person views the world or views you and what your role is. But if there's over-identification, then you can lose your moral compass. Like, I'll give you an example of this. During the Second World War in Germany, I'm sure most Germans were really good people, but the power of Hitler and the vulnerability of the German people, particularly in relation to Russia, the identification at the conceptual or the cognitive level with Hitler made it very difficult for people to maintain their moral grounding. And as a result of that, their own views and values, which prior to the Führer, so to speak, were lost. So one of the things that social psychologists are clear about is that, one, in the experience of empathy, that we have the capacity to be in resonance with others. But two, that it is important to recognize that you are not that other person. So it's being able to see things from and experience things from two different perspectives. One is the experience of resonance, but two is the metacognitive perspective that allows us to distinguish self from other. Without being able to make that distinction, it is very common that people experience overwhelm, and that is disabling. So that's sort of it in a nutshell, Aaron. I hope that's a little bit helpful.
That's super helpful. Roshi, would you be able to tell us about how to do that? So from a practical perspective, are there practices, are there ways that you might be able to suggest for people on this call to be able to do that?
So yes, there are a number of ways that you can make that a greater possibility. One is to enhance your capacity for what's called attentional balance, for being grounded, for being able to give your attention to an individual in a way that is not distracted, for being able to sustain your attention on that individual, but at the same time, to have a metacognitive perspective. In other words, when you begin to experience too much arousal, too much upregulation, when, for example, in my book, Standing at the Edge, I'm the director of a big medical project in the altitudes of Nepal, up in northwestern Nepal in Humla and Dolpo. And in one of our clinics, a young child, well, I didn't even know what was brought in. A man brought in this bundle, and he happened to be a deaf mute. The Nepali and Western clinicians went and unwrapped the bundle, and inside was a child who was terribly burned. And we took her into a back room, and the Nepali nurses began to debride the burns which were infected. And also some of the burns had maggots in them, and the child was really in terrible shape. And we did not have pediatric anesthesia. So the child was very upset, and I was standing right behind the clinicians and experienced over-identification with the child and actually almost fainted from the scene. But I was glad I had a practice. I could feel, I went into a vasovagal reaction. I could feel this reaction. I wanted to throw up, I wanted to faint, broke out into a cold sweat and so forth. And I was able to reallocate my attention to the sensation of my feet on the floor, and to begin and to withdraw my attention from the child who was in high distress, and to get myself grounded. And then out of that experience of being grounded, which is, it's very simple. It's like noticing what your somatic experience is. And then from standing outside of your experience, what we call metacognition, being able to notice what your experience is, and then to reallocate your attention to something that is neutral or grounding. And that produces the the capacity actually to be able to connect with suffering in a way where you're resourced. Because what happened to me in this instance, Aaron, it's a good example. When I was in this state of evaluating myself, I was also able to recognize the fact that this child would have died had she not been brought into the clinic. I felt gratitude for the clinicians. I was so grateful for the father bringing the child in, and so forth. So grounding, attentional balance, remembering why you're there, being able to develop this metacognitive capacity, the capacity to stand apart from your direct experience and to begin to help downregulate yourself so that you're not coming from reactivity. And a lot of that, Aaron, I learned as a meditation practitioner, of course. That is, learning how to concentrate, being able to be aware of my somatic experience and so forth. All of this has come, out of the meditation practice.
Thank you.
But I don't think you have to be a Buddhist to do it, it's a capacity that really anybody can learn.
That idea too of coming back to the grounding, that we like feeling our feet on the floor, I think becomes a very easy invitation as well, that many of us can take away to really just remember ourselves in moments where we're feeling difficult things. And I'll just invite anyone else who has questions along this line to share those into the chat. Another question is around saying no to different things. We in this field really want to help, and sometimes it becomes important to say no. And I know one of the things that you've spent some time thinking about is around the power of no. And I was wondering if you might be able to share some of your insight with us.
So what's, for me, the kind of work that I do where there's a great deal of demand on both my time and on my resources, it has been not to feel bad about saying no. It's more about being very transparent with my own capacities, and as well understanding that engaging in pathological altruism, which is to cause harm to myself mentally or physically in the course of service to others, or cause harm to the institution that I'm serving in, or to cause harm even by disempowering the people whom I'm endeavoring to serve. This is a real issue to be explored for us who are involved in direct service to others. It's to understand how pathological altruism arises, when it's present, and also how to dial back the pathology in our altruism. One of the ways is to have very clear boundaries. Another way is to be extremely self-honest. A third way is to engage, not to feel bad about taking a pause so that you can reflect more deeply on what will really serve. Another is to, instead of feeling as though we are the only vehicle of service, the only means of service, it is to turn the question around to those whom we are serving, and to look deeply to see what capacities, what resources are there in the individual or in the institutions that individual might be associated with. Instead of feeling as if we're the ones who hold all the gold, so to speak. And I think often we disempower those whom we're endeavoring to serve because we are, we have this feeling as if we're the saviors, the heroes, we've got all the answers, we have all the resources. And we forget that there are very deep and valued resources and wisdom in the communities we're serving and in the individuals we're serving, no matter how challenged they are.
Thank you, Roshi Halifax. I'm wondering if you might be able to tell us a bit from a personal perspective too, because I think this was something that you went through a journey with as well, learning how to say no. And how do you do that now?
I do it like everybody does it. I just say, I'm not able to do that right now, but I'm so grateful that you asked. I'm just a very plain person. And I don't, as I said, I'm almost 80 years old. And it wasn't until I was in my 60s that I learned to say no. And the cost of not saying no was so great that finally I got it. I thought, oh, it doesn't help me to draw water from a well that has no water in it. And it doesn't help others.
Thank you, Roshi Halifax.
It's not that we should feel hostility in our no. It's a no that has love in it, not guilt and not shame.
So coming back to more questions from the group, how can you recognize serving versus rescuing?
Oh, it's a wonderful question. There's a wonderful doctor named Rachel Naomi Remen who wrote these lines. She said, helping, fixing, and serving represent three different ways of seeing life. When you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. And when you serve, you see life as whole. And so it really is a kind of view. Our work is to see life as whole, the person whom we're serving as whole, the nation whom we're serving, which we're serving as whole. And so often we're operating out of the perspectives of helping and or fixing, weak or broken. So, really, we have to change our own view so often in this regard. We like to feel like heroes and be important and feel necessary, but actually what's important and what is necessary is how we serve others, not how we disempower them through our need to feel useful, important, and heroic.
I wonder if you might be up for leading us through a practice for perhaps 5 to 10 minutes, a practice that might help us with situations like you've just described, where we can better ground ourselves and be better present to situations we find ourselves in.
So, Aaron, I wanted, in preparation for that practice, I want to say that one of the most important things that I feel we need to revalue and develop in today's world is compassion. And I love what His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, said about compassion. He said, compassion is not a luxury. It is a necessity for human beings to survive. And I would say not just human beings, I would say all beings, whether it's the cetaceans or in the salmon in our waters of the world, or it's the deer and the bear or the bats. So I feel His Holiness really called it out there, but I am adding it's not just for humans, it's really for all species. And I began to look at this issue of compassion really because of my work inside of the medical system. What I saw in medicine was that many people came into the vocation of nursing or of being a doctor or a chaplain really out of love and altruism, really out of compassion. But as the training unfolded and as clinicians moved into various medical institutions, the compassion was driven out of them. And so what we're seeing in medicine is a profound deficit of compassion. And so I began to look at this since I teach so many clinicians, Aaron, and I realized that we don't really understand what compassion is. And by the way, compassion, first thing I want to say, and that's the exercise that we'll touch into, is that it's a win-win situation. We know from neuroscience and social psychology that compassion can benefit not only those whom are served, but as well those who manifest it. So I began to develop a heuristic map of compassion. And that map, Aaron, looked at compassion from several different points of view. And it came about in part from a thought experiment that I engaged in, where I asked myself, would compassion be possible without having attentional balance? You know, without us being grounded and without us being able to see things clearly, we aren't able to perceive the suffering that we're encountering in a clear way. And then I asked myself, is compassion possible without an individual being pro-social? And that question is, having a positive psychological qualities, including gratefulness, love, kindness, and so forth. And clearly, compassion is not possible without these. And then I asked, is compassion possible without there being insight? And somebody just mentioned Arthur Kleinman. Yes, I'm a big fan of his, D. And then I asked myself, is compassion possible without insight? No, compassion is not possible without deep discernment, and so forth. So I saw that compassion has that capacity, or is that capacity that is present when we're able to actually attend to the experience of another, where we feel concern about the well-being or suffering of another. When we, number 3, have the aspiration to actually transform the experience of another, and to do that from a point of view of discernment, what is aligned that will serve the other. And the 4th, that we intend to or engage in direct action, transforming with the intention to transform the experience of another in order to benefit them. So I developed a process called G.R.A.C.E. And I can just take us through that very simply in a few minutes. We have a big training program on that. Now educators and clinicians are using this in various parts of the world. And I think it's a very practical and simple approach to cultivating compassion as we are directly interacting with each other. So I'll just introduce that as a kind of guided practice for our community here. And I'm going to ask you, so it can work better, to imagine that you are in the presence of someone who is having a very difficult time. It could be a patient, it could be a client, it could be a parent, a child, a student. It's someone in the realm of your work where you feel a sense of connection, and that person is struggling. And I'm going to ask you, with that sense of being present for this person, on your next inhale, to actually gather your attention on the inhale as a way of getting grounded, and on the exhale, dropping into the body. And again, on the inhale, letting your attention rest deeply on the inhale, the sensation of the inhale, and on the exhale, dropping into the body, relaxing. That's the G of grace. Gathering your attention, getting grounded. This sets the kind of foundation of strength and support, so you can really be present for another. Then the R of grace, which is recall your intention. And for just a moment, remember really why you do this work that you do. That your connection with this person is about service, about your vow to alleviate suffering. And see if you can really allow yourself to be touched by the truth of this person's suffering in this moment, whatever it may be as you imagine it. And also to let yourself be filled with this deep love for what you do, what you care about, which is to benefit others. This is recalling your intention. And this perfumes the background of your practice as you begin now to shift your attention into whatever experience you're feeling as you presence this person that you have brought to mind in the practice we're doing right now. What is your somatic experience? What's the experience in the body? And just noticing it. So often we just dissociate from the body. The body is an extraordinary repository of information. Our biases show up in our body. Our preferences show up in our body. Our fears show up in our body, even before we feel them in the heart or see them with the mind. And notice what you're experiencing emotionally. Can you check in first? What's your emotional experience right now? And also cognitively, What's happening in your mind? What thought is passing through your mind right now? And see if you can expand your subjectivity now to include the physical experience of another and what their feelings might be. And how they might see their situation. And being in touch with their experience, which is it being in attunement, the A of grace. Move to the C of grace. Consider what will really serve. What will really serve this person? What will really serve this situation? And see if you can sit with both not knowing and let also the sense of a kind of deeper wisdom be present for yourself. And then the E of grace is how might you engage? Sometimes it's doing nothing, sometimes it's doing something. How might you engage? And imagine yourself engaging in an action that is a benefit to this person. And then the second part of the E of grace is how do you end this interaction? Learning to end is really important, to conclude. Do you express gratitude? Do you need to ask for forgiveness? Do you share appreciation? Is this something you do just inside yourself, or do you do this interpersonally? And then let go. Come back to the breath body. And always in this kind of practice that whatever you have learned that is helpful, or whatever you have felt personally has benefited you, dedicate it to the welfare of the one that you brought into your visualization. So thank you.
Thank you, Roshi Joan.
I just want to again tell you, the G of grace is gathering your attention. The R of grace is recalling your intention. The A of grace is attuning to yourself first. We're so diagnostic, we always go and try to figure out the other person instead of really resting in our own subjectivity for at least a pulse, attuning to yourself and then attuning to the other. The C of grace is considering what will really serve, and the E of grace is engaging and ending. And I can send you a little meme, Aaron, which you can share with your people in case it's useful.
We'll do that. And maybe we could just invite people just to check in too about what this practice with Roshi Halifax was like. Any feelings, just checking in where you are right now. It's also a way for Roshi Halifax to see how the community
You.
has taken. Roshi Halifax, we're coming to the last bit of our time together as well. And I was wondering if there was something that you thought was, like, with all of the things that you've shared, if there was something that you thought was particularly important to share with people that are engaged in so many different ways, on the front lines in responding to communities around the world at this moment. Is there, what would you like to share?
You know, I want to just share how hopeful I am in the midst of this global pandemic. Also facing an environmental catastrophe of enormous proportions. The sixth extinction we're in the process of. Polarization, it all seems so futile. But I also have this sense of, it's like a J curve. I feel this incredible sense of hopefulness. I don't know what is ahead, but I do know that there are communities like you bubbling up all over the world who are moving in the direction of good and who are deeply dedicated to staying in this process of catastrophe. And I mean, honestly, at my age, my whole lifetime, I thought I saw some pretty bad stuff. This really is number one. I mean, we are in something that our economies, our national identities, the threat from fundamentalism, racism is just enormous. And yet, as deep as the shadow is right now, there is so much power and good coming forward. And we have an opportunity, I believe, to engage in a radical phase shift together through this kind of alignment that many of us are feeling with and through each other, to foster a world ahead that will be sane and just. So this is my great honor in being with all of you, with the sense of, you know, your work. And I hope that a little tiny bit of what I've shared this morning can be put to use in your lives so that you're not only resilient, but that you can thrive. That you're not only just sort of gritting it out, so to speak, but like Maya Angelou said not so long ago, she said, my mission in life is not merely to survive, but to thrive. And I think that all of us can envision our own process at this time as fostering growth beyond mere survival. And this includes the blessing of humility as we struggle in our various ways through this situation, really cherishing our relationships with each other. Instead of anticipating just more and more catastrophe, actually visualizing a braver future, and also the deep value of the development of moral character. What is it to live deeply aligned with our values? And I feel that it is exactly in the circle that you are part of, where these qualities are being nourished so that we have more internal resources to meet the world and to be part of this movement as we move forward to bring a just and sane and compassionate future into being.
Thank you, Roshi Halifax. Maybe I'll just ask one last question as we close, because someone asked a beautiful question of you that I think takes us back to the beginning and to where you are. And so back to the mountainside. Would you be able to share with us some of the ways that your hermitage resources you?
Well, here's what I feel like doing. I'm going to step outside my hermitage. Going to take you on a little kind of view. I don't know if you can see.
Wow.
So it's really beautiful where I am, but you know, there's no plumbing that most of you enjoy. The electrical is solar. The water is harvested off the roof. There's the wood stove that keeps the little hut I'm in warm in the winter. So I have to chop wood and literally carry water. And how does that resource me? It brings me close to the bone of the natural world and the bone of life. And I love it. But the other thing is having a period of solitude and a time for deep reflection is really important for me. And that is a huge resource. Being in the natural world, and of course now I don't travel. I used to travel, as Jeff and others know. 2/3 of my time I'd be in Japan or Nepal or China or wherever. And now I'm grounded. I just moved from my Zen center up to my hermitage. And I feel the blessing of this time and also the privilege that has been conferred upon me by not having to, go out into the world very much right now, except virtually. And it also gives me energy, if you will, to turn back this privilege, my good fortune of being protected and resourced in this situation, in terms of meeting, having the opportunity to meet with people like you. So it's great. I'm in the wilds, but I'm with you. I'm in 125, 130 living rooms, bedrooms, with new friends who are doing great work in the world.
Roshi Halifax, I think I speak on behalf of all of us that it's been a pleasure to spend time with you and also to be with you for a moment, perched on the mountainside. Just for everyone to know, our session next week is going to be with Parker Palmer and Sharon Salzberg doing their duet one more time. And as we come to the end, I'm wondering if we might be able to do a goodbye in a way so Roshi Halifax can see the community of us that have been together by turning on our videos, and as we sign off, maybe just saying our name and wishing her and the community goodbye. I think it'd be a wonderful way for her to take in this community that she spent time with. And thank you, everyone. It's been a beautiful gift to be together again.